So last week during the prayer, I mentioned the situation going on, developing here on the Upper West Side. I asked you to keep in your thoughts a group of homeless New Yorkers who had been moved to our neighborhood. They'd been living in a shelter that was deemed unsafe because of social distancing being impossible where they were. Now, this was a scene and is a scene playing off across the city. Thousands of unhoused individuals and family being moved to safer places. Roughly 300 ended up at the Lucerne Hotel, located at West 79th Street and Amsterdam Avenue, in the heart of our neighborhood, a few blocks from 4th Universalist. Now, before I get into too many details about all of this, I know there are a lot of people who've been coming each and every week that aren't in New York, who don't maybe know New York, and who maybe have never even been to New York. I know we have friends joining from Mexico and Canada, Ireland and Spain, and I'm sure many other places too. But even though what I'm talking about today is super local, I think it can be considered a case study for what I know happens everywhere. A case study in liberal and progressive hypocrisy. The talking of a good game when it comes to others doing the hard work of justice, but when asked something of us, affects us or our families or our community or our bottom line, then suddenly we feel differently, we cry foul, and we push back. So for those of you unfamiliar with our neighborhood here on the Upper West Side, a few things to know. It's a large neighborhood, 200,000 people strong. It is economically well off and largely white. It is a cultural heart of the city, home to countless museums, the New York Philharmonic, Metropolitan Opera, New York City Ballet, Juilliard School of Music. It's a neighborhood where Seinfeld took place in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. The Upper West Side is also incredibly liberal and proud of it. In a recent study done by the New York Times, the Upper West Side has not only the zip code with the highest number of donors in the country for Joe Biden, but 3 out of the 4 highest zip codes in terms of donors for Joe Biden. It could not be any more blue. Which makes the situation with the homeless at the Lucerne Hotel all the more noteworthy. Because almost immediately upon the arrival of these homeless people into the new home, opposition began. A Facebook group started, attracted more than 15,000 members, demanding that these new residents be removed. They were accused without evidence of being sex offenders and drug addicts, and more generally disrupting and destroying the neighborhood. Politicians were lobbied heavily. Great numbers of money were raised, and it escalated. Angry residents were encouraged to use hornet spray and dog feces to deter and assault homeless men they encountered. Even a noose was discovered hanging on scaffolding surrounding the hotel where they lived. It was getting ugly. And it did not go unnoticed by the media that this was supposed to be a supposedly enlightened and progressive neighborhood. After a summer of liberal talk about Black Lives Matter and marches in the streets, there seemed to be a marked difference in how the neighborhood was responding when they themselves were faced with real black and brown people in the neighborhood. When racial justice showed up as the homeless, as poor, and yes, sometimes struggling with mental illness and addiction. All of that lofty and high-minded rhetoric disappeared. The liberal tune changed. Suddenly, the neighborhood was falling apart. Suddenly, we were returning to the bad old days of the 70s and 80s. The children were in danger, and property values were going to be decimated. Now, to be clear, research shows that there has been no spike in crime in the area surrounding the Lucerne Hotel. The manager of the restaurant on the ground floor of the hotel said there has not been a single complaint about the homeless residents or a single disruption from them of their restaurant. I personally have walked by that hotel several times and literally seen 0 homeless people. And the organization running the shelter is highly respected, offering essential services to needy residents as well as security for them and the community. And yet apparently, these men need to go. The pressure grew so great that 2 weeks ago, even Mayor Bill de Blasio, himself supposedly a proud liberal and progressive, personally ordered the homeless to be removed from the hotel, bowing to public pressure, to be reallocated once again. It was sad and predictable. People who talk a big game about justice when it is just a theory, or when it is in someone else's neighborhood, or when it's someone else's problem, but when it comes time for them to share the burden or the load, or to feel uncomfortable, or to grow a little bit in their level of comfort, their support dissolves and their proud spine weakens. And in this case, they didn't even just do that. They fell back into the very same tactics that they claimed to despise: misinformation, fear-mongering, racially charged accusations. How can people say things like, "I'm a big believer of Black Lives Matter, but this is too much," and not realize their hypocrisy? Perhaps it is selfishness. Maybe it's a fear of losing status. Maybe they had one bad experience, and that colors the entire issue. Maybe it's just a form of NIMBYism, not in my backyard-ism. Fundamentally, what I don't understand is what these folks think movements like Black Lives Matter are all about. What do they think defunding the police and investing in social services mean? What do they think solving the homeless crisis in New York City looks like? It seems obvious to me that it looks exactly like what they're doing in the Lucerne Hotel. It means a thoughtful approach that involves high-quality care and a diverse range of services. It means partnering with nonprofits that know what they're doing and have a history of doing it well and protecting the safety of those most at risk. What it is not is, in the midst of a pandemic, accusing the most vulnerable and at-risk people of being criminals and drug dealers and menaces to children, when they are the ones who are most in danger in this moment. That's not what progressive people do. That's not what compassionate people do. It's not what people who have studied systemic solutions to homelessness do. That's what right-wing racist dog whistlers peddling falsehoods do. It's what hypocrites do. It is not right nor progressive to insist that the homeless belong in some other community, that they are not our problem, whatever that means, because we, for some reason, deserve to be free from their struggle or their solutions, even though those of us on the Upper West Side, of which I am a member, live in one of the richest neighborhoods with the most absurdly high rent that has forced nearly everyone living here without a high salary out of their home. It is not right nor progressive to ignore the reason why so many people are homeless. It's because the wealth gap has grown so vast, and that most current Upper West Siders have benefited from a system that makes the wealthy wealthier and the poor poorer, and that those who are wealthy bear responsibility for that unjustifiable inequality and an obligation to those harmed by it, especially those who can no longer afford housing in this city. A commitment to justice cannot be just when it is easy or when it is someone else's problem. If it is, that is performative justice. It is virtue signaling. It's about status and appearance and ego. And it makes us hypocrites. Hypocrites are those who posture as allies but vanish when asked to be uncomfortable. Hypocrites are those who say they will have your back, but when the struggle begins, when it's time for them to join in, are nowhere to be found, or make excuses about why this time it's different, conveniently when they themselves have skin in the game. Now, this kind of hypocrisy is some of the worst behavior in the struggle for justice because it is fundamentally dishonest. It lies about a person's true commitment to causes of freedom and equality. And worst of all, it gives false hope to those who truly need and depend on their allies' support. It promises necessary solidarity, but leads only to betrayal. This is not even about ideology or what you believe. It's about telling the truth about who you are, who we say we are. I want to live in a neighborhood that actually is what it says it is, whose reaction to a sincere and thoughtful approach to support the most vulnerable people in our city is not get them out of here. We pay good rent money to avoid people like that. But instead, how can we help? It's our turn. And also, welcome. We are here for you because we want to be part of the solution. This past week, I'm glad to say there was a backlash to the backlash. Protests of the mayor's decision to remove the residents led him to announce a temporary halt in their removal. It is a start. I don't know how temporary it will be. It will fall on us to make sure that our community sticks to its proposed values. Whether you live here on the Upper West Side or not, whether you live in Manhattan or New York City or New York State or not, this kind of hypocrisy happens everywhere. It's an issue that we see when we claim that we want fairness in education, equality, and yet we oppose efforts to integrate schools or bus students or fund school districts through means other than property taxes, which has to be one of the most unfair ways to support schools. It's an issue of hypocrisy when we see and want and demand fair labor practices for farm workers, but dismiss the ethically produced food as too expensive, even if we could afford it. It's hypocritical if we're railing against climate change, yet oppose the creation of more bike lanes and walkways in our city. Or perhaps this week, we've seen it when believing that a Supreme Court justice should never be chosen right before an election, until you change your mind 4 years later when you are doing the choosing. We have to be aware and sensitive to those moments in our own lives when our values challenge us, and those things we care about when we are asked to change and think and feel differently. And we all face this struggle, no matter who we are. So are there times for you when the principles you believe in touch your actual life, when you feel intuitively in your heart some uncomfortable resistance, perhaps even resentment, that impulse to rationalize or excuse some inconsistency, moments of, well, yes, but in this case? Are there times that something sounds great until it doesn't anymore because it hits some nerve in us? I want to ask you to lean into that, to recognize that. I don't want you to feel shame about it because we all have it. That's what human beings do. But we also can be wise enough and reflective enough to recognize it and then act differently. The counter values to hypocrisy are self-awareness, honesty, and courage to be who we say we are, despite the resistance in our own hearts, to live into our principles, even when it's not convenient. Whether we live on the Upper West Side or across the world, as Unitarian Universalists or just as people who want to live with integrity. If we are progressive, if we are liberal, if we believe in compassion and systemic change and equality, then let us believe in them. And to really believe, we have to live them. So let's do that and make sure that our neighborhoods, wherever that may be, whoever is in them, that we do the same and honor that. May it be so, and amen.